50 weeks have passed since that infamous day in which the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, setting in motion the Pacific War that we've been covering in this series. For many months, we've seen the relentless Japanese forces achieve tremendous feats of conquest, but also commit horrendous war crimes against innocent people. We've seen the tenacious Allied defenders suffer defeat after defeat, only to get back up again to fight the ruthless invaders. And we've seen the sacrifices of brave men and women on both sides of the war that gave up their lives for what they believed to be a good cause. Now we're in a stage in which the Japanese Empire has surrendered the initiative to the Allies in the Pacific. With the recent victories on the Guadalcanal and Kokoda track campaigns, today we'll see the Australian and American soldiers continue to counterattack as the tide turns against the invaders. Obviously, these powers would go to great lengths to control distant territory, but today we've got an offer on some territory that you can gain for yourself very easily because this video is sponsored by Established Titles. They sell small plots of land in Scotland, which are sought after because of a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lairds, or lords and ladies in English. But to protect these lands, a tree is planted with every order, preserving picturesque woodland and biodiversity, and Established Titles supports charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. You'll get at least 1 square foot of land in Scotland, with a unique plot number and a certificate to prove it. This allows you to officially get Lord or Lady on your credit cards, plane tickets, and more. You can also get maps to show your new estate, including the immensely detailed hand-drawn 1611 map by John Speed, held by the National Library of Scotland. It makes a great last-minute gift, and they even have couple packs that come with adjoining plots of land. The first 200 plots bought via our link will all be put together within a few minutes of each other next to the Kings and Generals plot, so act fast to join our little union of forest territories. Check out their early Black Friday sale for discounts. Plus, if you use our code KINGS, you'll get an extra 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/kings to get yourself a title or give it as a gift and help support the channel. This week first takes us to Guadalcanal. After the 4th carrier battle of the war and the failed Japanese offensive to take Henderson Field, both sides had mixed feelings. The Americans were suffering an atmosphere of tense expectation after the loss of Hornet, leaving only 1 carrier active in the Pacific. In that regard, President Roosevelt ordered 20 ships to be released for the Southwest Pacific, although he still set out his priorities on the North African front. At the same time, the Japanese reported that they had sunk 4 carriers and a battleship at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, a result that they believed tilted the balance of naval power decisively in Japan's favour. Thus, they were confidently preparing for another offensive to take Guadalcanal, further believing that they'd been very close to victory on their last attempt. Immediate plans were then drawn by the 17th Army, calling for the 51st Division and the 21st Independent Mixed Brigade to reinforce the 2nd Division, while the 38th Division was appointed to land at Collie Point for an attack from the east. To transport so many forces, however, would require approximately 800 destroyer runs and 20 seaplane tender runs. For Yamamoto, this plan was so unrealistic that success might be unattainable with such brains in charge of the 17th Army. Because of this, the Collie operation would be dropped on October 30th, and by November 4th, a more realistic plan had been drafted, calling for the neutralization of Henderson Field with more air raids and naval bombardments to cover the movement of 1 large convoy to the island. Additionally, the Japanese would have to relieve some of their exhausted and depleted air units, as in the course of 1 month, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 2/3 of its strength, including many highly skilled crews. The same would also be done by the Americans, with Brigadier General Lewis Woods taking command of this renewed Cactus Air Force. During the last few days, Henderson Field had also been completely repaired, and a second airstrip, labelled Fighter 2, had been built to the northwest. Meanwhile, General Vandergrift and Admiral Halsey had decided not to passively wait for another Japanese attack in this time. As Halsey prepared the 8th Marine Regiment, the 2nd Raider Battalion, and the 182nd Regiment to reinforce Guadalcanal, Vandegrift was planning to conduct a limited offensive to clear out the Matanikau area so that Henderson Field would be out of artillery range. His plan was for Colonel Edson's 5th Marines to lead an attack to seize Kokombona and drive the enemy back across the Poha River, while the Whaling Group supported them with an attack through the One Log Bridge and the 2nd Marines were held in reserve. In front of them, General Sumiyoshi had Colonel Nakaguma's 4th Regiment guarding the western bank of the Matanikau, with Colonel Oka's half-strength 124th Regiment extending the Japanese line into Mount Austin. During the early hours of November 1st, the Matanikau offensive began as American engineers threw a trio of footbridges across the river for the 5th Marines to cross. By 0700, with B-17s raining bombs over the Japanese, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 5th Marines had successfully crossed, then started their separate movements inland and on the coast. An hour later, the 3rd Battalion joined the rest of the Marines, while they advanced facing almost no opposition. Farther south, the Whaling Group had also crossed the One Log Bridge, and was moving parallel to the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines. Yet at 0830, the 1st Battalion was suddenly met with a lash of machine gun and artillery fire from Nakaguma's 7th Company. The fighting in front of Point Cruz was bloody, with the Marines suffering heavy casualties as they were driven by a Japanese counterattack. Late in the afternoon, Edson sent the 3rd Battalion to join in the struggle, and although the Marines would manage to regroup, they still couldn't break through the strong Japanese defences. The lack of progress finally forced Edson to order his 2nd Battalion to veer north to the coast and envelop the enemy, with the Whaling Group and the 2nd Marines taking over their march. Yet at the same time, Nakaguma's 2nd Battalion had suffered so many losses that it had almost vanished against the enemy. Thus, Sumiyoshi would send the 2nd Anti-Tank Gun Battalion to hold off the American offensive at a pre-prepared emplacement behind Point Cruz. On November 2nd, Edson's Marines resumed their advance, with his 2nd Battalion rapidly completing the encirclement of the Japanese position. Difficult cave fighting then ensued, while the 2nd Battalion started a bayonet charge late in the day that sliced through the northern portion of the enemy defences. On November 3rd, with the Whaling Group and 2nd Marines advancing well beyond Point Cruz, Edson's Marines would at last reduce the Japanese pocket, capturing a substantial amount of equipment and artillery. In contrast, Nakaguma fielded less than 500 soldiers, and was only reinforced with some 170 sapped men, so he was contemplating seeking death in a final charge with the regimental colours. Yet he would be ordered not to charge, as the Japanese needed to contain the enemy at all costs, or else the 2nd Division's retreat would be cut off at Kokombuna. Without any other possible reinforcements to throw against the enemy, the Japanese needed a miracle at Matanikau. Meanwhile, the Americans had discovered that 5 Japanese destroyers were going to land some 300 soldiers at Collie Point, with 2 mountain guns and provisions for the Shoji detachment on the night of November 2nd. To contain this new enemy threat, Vandegrift had sent the 2nd Battalion 7th Marines of Colonel Hanneken to march east and intercept this convoy. During the night, as the Japanese tried to unload their cargo under SBD attacks, Hanneken had crossed the Metapona River, aligning his forces in the woods in front of the beach for the incoming ambush. Yet communication problems would prevent them from receiving their orders to attack, so the invaders would manage to land their 300 soldiers and provisions unhindered. At dawn on November 3rd, however, the Japanese then began to advance down the beach, rapidly stumbling across Hanneken's forces and engaging them in a heavy mortar duel. Still without communications and suffering many casualties, Hanneken would decide to pull back to the west bank of the Nalimbio by midday, where he finally managed to send a message to Vandegrift alerting him of the strong Japanese presence in the east. Believing that the invaders were going to land an additional division at Collie in preparation for another major offensive, Vandegrift at last decided to terminate the Matanikau offensive so that he could shift most of his forces to counter the Collie Point threat. Thus, as the 1st Battalion 7th Marines were sent to immediately reinforce Hanneken, Edson's forces were recalled to Lunga Point, and 3 battalions were left to hold the western front, some 2,000 yards west of Point Cruz. Surprisingly, the Japanese miracle had come, and the 2nd Division would have an open route to safely arrive at Kokombona. Additionally, the Shoji detachment was beginning to reach Collie, so the Japanese could hope to hold this position against the enemy attacks. His arrival, however, was off to a bad start, as Marine aircraft managed to kill 100 of his men as they arrived. At the same time, Vandegrift had appointed General Rupertus to command the Joint Service Collie Point operation, assigning him the 164th Regiment, 2 tank companies, and the 3rd Battalion 10th Marines' howitzers. On the morning of November 4th, while the Japanese were subjected to a naval bombardment, Rupertus's forces commenced their difficult march through alternating gnarled swamps and parched grassy plains, arriving at the Nalimbiu only by nightfall. The following day, they would then cross the river to envelop the Japanese inland flank, but yet again they were met with heavy resistance by the difficult terrain. Meanwhile, 2 main events transpired during these days. First, as the 8th Marines got to Lunga, Carlson's raiders had landed unopposed at Aula on November 4th to clear the way for the construction of a new airfield. And second, on the night of November 5th, the first Japanese reinforcement convoy arrived at Tassafaronga, bringing General Ito's 228th Regiment to Guadalcanal. Finally, on the morning of November 6th, the 7th Marines crossed the Nalimbiu to join Rupertus for the attack on Collie. But we'll have to wait until next week for that, as we now have to return to New Guinea to continue with the Australian counter-offensive on the Kokoda track. Back in late October, their victory on Iora Creek had left the road open to Kokoda, as General Horii had decided to pull back to Oivi-Gorari, where he established his new defensive line. Upon assuming command of the 7th Division, General Vassi then ordered the 25th Brigade to lead the pursuit of the enemy forces towards Kokoda, while the 16th Brigade rested for the eventual capture of Oivi and the establishment of a bridgehead over the Kamusi River. By the end of October, the 2nd 1st and 2nd 2nd Battalions had secured Alola and Isurava, so the Australians now had recuperated one of their main dropping areas for supply, although the percentage of recovery there was still low. They would then continue along the right fork of the track towards Misima, leaving Isurava as a staging ground for Brigadier Ether's forces, which were still making their difficult way over the mountains. Despite this slowness on the left, Vassi didn't want to lose his impetus on the right, so on November 1st, he ordered Brigadier Lloyd to push on to Kobara. Meanwhile, the 25th Brigade was finally starting their advance on Kokoda with haste, with patrols from the 2nd 31st Battalion entering Kokoda to find no enemy opposition in the afternoon. Thus, by November 2nd, the Australians had firmly secured their control over the Kokoda and Kobara areas, regaining their airfield so that they could finally land supplies and enable all soldiers to fight on the front. The following day, as the Australians resupplied with airdrops, Vassi ordered Lloyd to advance towards Wairapi and defeat the Japanese at the Oivi-Gorari area. Yet after passing Pirivi, the Australians would be met with a rain of fire coming from Oivi, where General Horii had constructed defensive bunkers above the high ground. From there, Colonel Yazawa's 41st Regiment would successfully pin down the enemy, forcing the Australians to halt and retreat for the day. Additionally, Horii had deployed Colonel Tsukamoto's forces around Gorari, with the Kawada Battalion holding Waju to provide a defensive perimeter, and Tsukamoto's 1st Battalion in close support to Yazawa. On the morning of November 4th, the 2nd 2nd Battalion started to move forward again, suffering heavy machine gun fire and the shells of a mountain gun. The 2nd 3rd soon joined their frontal assault the following day, but not much progress could be made against the entrenched positions of the enemy. On October 26th, the Australians would even have to be reinforced with the 3rd Battalion, as heavy Japanese counterattacks left them holding thinly around their perimeter. But at this point, seeing that his frontal assaults were making little progress, Vassi decided to send the 25th Brigade on a flanking movement towards Gorari, where he would be joined by the 2nd 1st Battalion, which was already advancing from Kabara towards Elimo, and would have to retrace its steps back to Waju. Marching with haste, both forces would meet at Lini's Corner on the night of November 7th. Ether would then start his attack on Waju the following morning, achieving full surprise against the Kawada Battalion. Thus, Horii's forces were caught up in a pincer maneuver, with the 2nd Brigade applying pressure from the west, and the 25th Brigade attacking from the south. To counter this, the Kokoda battalion withdrew to Baribe, where it was to be reinforced by the 2nd Battalion. There, the 2nd 31st and 2nd 25th Battalions launched a two-pronged assault that put heavy pressure on the blocking force. At the same time, American aircraft began to bombard and strafe Yazawa's positions at Oivi, giving much-needed support to the battered 16th Brigade. Despite this, Lloyd had suffered almost 400 casualties since the start of the battle, so he couldn't achieve any breakthrough against the enemy. Yet the pressure was high, and this eventually forced Horii to order an evacuation towards the Kumusi River, which was further hampered by torrential rains. Additionally, Tsukamoto's battalion had to pull back towards Gorari to cover the Japanese evacuation, and Yazawa would have to start gradually thinning his defences in a piecemeal withdrawal. On the morning of November 9th, the 2nd 33rd and 2nd 1st Battalions finally joined the struggle, bypassing the surrounded Baribe positions and attacking directly against Horii's headquarters at Gorari. Coming from the west, Tsukamoto would manage to pin down and repel the 2nd 33rd, but still the 2nd 1st Battalion would successfully capture Horii's supply stores and the Lawuni Creek Bridge to the east. Horii's defensive strategy had turned into a disaster now, as all his forces had been cut off by the enemy. Without any other choice, Horii ordered a general withdrawal to the Kumusi that could only be done piecemeal because of the Australian infiltrations. On November 10th, Horii also had finally been pushed back out of Gorari, and in a desperate all-or-nothing move, he ordered his forces to rush the enemy positions with rifle and machine gun fire so as to open an avenue of escape. Even despite a devastating mountain gun barrage, the Japanese would fail to break through by November 11th, so they would have to cross the flood-swollen Oivi and Lawuni creeks and fight their way through to Papaki. By night, Yazawa's forces had successfully abandoned Oivi, only to find strong resistance around Gorari, so he would also decide to cross the Oivi Creek and make for the coast. And further south, Kawada's forces had failed to break through as well, then getting completely overrun by a major attack from both flanks, with few survivors managing to slip away towards Papaki. Meanwhile, units from the 2nd 31st and 2nd 1st Battalions would also cross the Lawuni, attacking the retreating Japanese soldiers from the rear, and successfully overrunning a 200-strong enemy rearguard. By November 14th, the remnants of Horii's elite South Seas detachment had crossed the Kumusi at Papaki and were now making their way to Garua, in preparation for their last defense of the Bunagona area. Concurrently, the Australians had reached the Kumusi around Wairopi on November 13th, finding there large stocks of abandoned artillery, equipment and supplies. Yet the Wairopi bridge had been destroyed, and it would not be until November 16th that Vasi's forces would manage to cross the river. After reuniting with Yazawa's forces on Pinga, Horii was anxious to get to Garua before the Allied attack on Buna started, and thus he decided to go down the remainder of the flooded Kumusi on a raft. Yet Horii's raft would soon get stuck on a submerged tree, and he would have to continue his journey on a canoe found nearby. Finally, the canoe would capsize under a fierce thunderstorm, and Horii would drown in the Kumusi because of his debilitation and prolonged hunger. Thus came the end of one of the most legendary generals of the Imperial Japanese Army, and thus came the end of the Counterattack campaign. Although the South Seas detachment had suffered more than 800 casualties, their last stand at Oivi-Gorari would allow Japanese engineers to establish a strong defensive system around Buna, Gona and Sanananda that would give a lot of trouble to the Allied forces in the future. Thanks again to our sponsor, Established Titles. Buy a small plot of land in Scotland and become a lady or a lord, or give this title as an amazing and easy gift. In return, Established Titles plants a tree to protect the pristine forests of our planet. Take advantage of their early Black Friday sale and use our discount code KINGS at establishedtitles.com/kings to get a further 10% off. Next week, join us as we delve into the critical naval battle of Guadalcanal and the end of the Collie Point action. To see that and more, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.